A new chapter tonight in a decades-old murder case. One man exonerated after 15 years behind bars.
And now the spotlight turns to another man in custody who had befriended the victim's daughter.
In the early hours of July 7, 1985, 54-year-old Jane Hylton was found beaten and stabbed to death. She was discovered in a bedroom at her employer's house, a house she moved into only the previous day, seeking refuge from a troubled marriage. Jane was discovered by two fellow housemates and her own daughter, Autumn. The murder made no sense, and the case dragged for 14 years, until two new detectives reopened the cold case in 1999. A misquote in an article led investigators to point the finger at Ricky Davis. Davis was eventually tried for the crime and convicted, all the while proclaiming his innocence. Determined not to give up, he sought help from the same justice system that put him behind bars. 15 years later, Davis was exonerated and the real killer found thanks to genetic genealogy testing and the determination of a group called the Innocence Project, who were determined to find the truth. Jane was a familiar face around El Dorado Hills, California. She was a columnist for Foothill Times. She often covered social events in and around town for the paper. Jane had 6 children whom she loved and often wrote poetry to help inspire them daily. She'd been working toward getting her real estate license and was married to Archie Hylton in 1984. However, by July 1985, their marriage started to fall apart. It was then she asked her employer, Wilma Klein, for assistance. Klein owned a fairly large home in El Dorado Hills. With her lived her daughter, Maureen Klein, and her boyfriend. Wilma's grandson, Ricky Davis, and his girlfriend, Connie Dahl, also occupied a room at the house. On July 6, 1985, Wilma welcomed Jane and her youngest daughter, 13-year-old Autumn Anchor, into her home. By all accounts, it was a full house. The first night of her new life would prove to be the night her life ended. At 3:30 a.m., Ricky Davis, then 20, and his girlfriend, 19-year-old Connie Dahl, returned from a party to find Autumn lingering about outside. She told them she was out late and afraid her mother was going to be angry. All three made their way into the house. There was blood in the hallway. It was silent as they reached the first room, belonging to Maureen, Ricky's mother. On the bed was the bloodied body of Jane Hylton. She was not breathing. Maureen and her boyfriend had gone on a camping trip and were not home at the time. Ricky and Connie called 911. Paramedics and police arrived, but Jane was pronounced dead at the scene. She had suffered 29 stab wounds, was beaten and bitten on her shoulder. It was a senseless murder, and investigators began to interview those closest to Jane. Archie Hylton, Jane's estranged husband, was interviewed and provided detectives with a solid alibi and DNA. Archie had been the logical choice as he and Jane had been going through a rough patch. He, however, said that the marriage was not over and that there was no trouble between them. He was cleared and all leads went cold. Ricky Davis and Connie Dahl both told investigators they arrived home in the early morning hours and found Autumn waiting outside. When they entered the house, they found the hallway carpet bloodied. The blood trail led them to the master bedroom where they found Jane lying dead on the bloodied mattress. They speculated that an intruder may have been responsible for the murder. For 14 years, the case remained unsolved. The cold case reopened in 1999. El Dorado County Sheriff's detectives Richard Strasser and Rick Fitzgerald were tasked with the investigation. After poring over paperwork, they zoomed in on a news article. Connie Dahl, former girlfriend of Ricky Davis and housemate of Jane Hylton, had given an interview to a reporter. She was quoted saying Hylton's body was lying in bed like someone placed her there in the position she would normally sleep in. This statement seemed to contradict a muffled audio recording of a statement that Davis had previously made. Detective Fitzgerald falsely thought he heard him say the body was found on the floor. Dahl was, at the time, serving a jail sentence in Oregon on unrelated charges. Detectives brought her in for an interview and began a 3-hour-long interrogation. Initially, Dahl stuck to her original story. Over the next 18 months, though, she would be interrogated 4 times. Detectives were found to have used techniques known to increase the chances of a false confession. Dahl was systematically forced into incriminating Davis and Jane's daughter Autumn in the murder. Dahl was threatened with a charge of murder. If she cooperated, though, she'd be given a lenient sentence of manslaughter and serve only a year. Detectives Strasser and Fitzgerald told Dahl that DNA evidence was going to be used to trace the suspect. In truth, no DNA evidence was brought into the case during that period. In truth, testing had not been done on the DNA recovered from the scene. By showing her crime scene photos and using facts from the crime, such as the bite mark on Jane's shoulder, investigators fed Dahl the information they wanted to hear. Over the course of the 4 interviews, Dahl was starting to break. She began remembering facts from the crime. This in turn allowed her to fabricate and create an entirely different account of events from the night of the murder. In one interview, Dahl said that Autumn was present during the murder of Jane and was sprayed with blood. In another, she confessed that she was probably the person that bit Jane on the shoulder. Dahl would say that the murder began with an argument between Davis and Jane. She alleged that Davis wanted Autumn to join them at a party. When Jane refused, Davis erupted in a fit of anger, leading to the death of Jane. Her story kept changing to fit the facts being fed. However, she couldn't remember the weapon used for the murder or where it was eventually hidden. Dahl had implicated her ex-boyfriend Davis in the murder of Jane Hylton. He was now the prime suspect. Ricky Davis and Autumn Anker were also interviewed following the confession of Connie Dahl. Both Davis and Anker stuck to their original accounts of the crime. Detectives again lied to Davis, telling him that Anker had also implicated him in the murder. Anker told detectives she had no reason to protect Davis when they threatened her with culpability regarding the murder. Despite their interrogation techniques, detectives could not sway Davis or Anker to change their stories. They therefore used the confession of Dahl to arrest Davis. Dahl was offered a plea bargain to testify against Davis at his trial. Davis's first trial was declared a mistrial by jurors. His second, in 2005, would eventually convict him. Dahl took the stand and testified against Davis. She told the court of how she struggled with Jane and she herself accidentally bit the victim on the shoulder. She went on to say that she went outside as Davis continued the bloody assault on Hylton. Dahl said she could hear screaming, pleading, and gurgling as Davis continued the brutal attack. Based entirely on the testimony of Dahl's account of events, Davis was sentenced to 16 years in prison for the second-degree murder of Jane Hylton. Dahl received a lesser charge of manslaughter and received a year-long sentence at the county jail. Dahl, though, would eventually die from a drug overdose in 2014. Meanwhile, Davis was not going down without a fight. He maintained his innocence and in 2006 made contact with the Northern California Innocence Project. He asked if they could help him prove that he was wrongly convicted. The NCIP was founded in 2001 by Kathleen Rodolphe and Linda Starr. The project began after legislation offered convicted inmates to seek DNA testing to prove their innocence. It's a non-profit clinical program of Santa Clara University's School of Law. After Davis made contact with the NCIP in 2006, his case was put through a thorough re-examination. Cooperation between the NCIP and the El Dorado County District Attorney's Office allowed for the DNA recovered from the crime scene to be retested post-conviction. Evidence from the crime scene included Hylton's nightgown and biological material found under her fingernails. The results revealed an unknown male DNA profile. DNA from Hylton's fingernails and nightgown were both found to be from the same source. Test results eliminated Davis, Dahl, and Anker. This proved Dahl's testimony was contradictory to the physical evidence and therefore had to have been fabricated. The DNA also proved Archie Hylton innocent. Unfortunately, he had passed away by the time results were released. The DNA profile found was entered into the FBI Combined Index DNA system, CODIS, but no matches were found. Although the evidence seemed to prove Davis's consistent claim of innocence correct, there were some hurdles that still needed to be jumped. The NCIP successfully argued that had the DNA results been presented to the jury during Davis's trial, the outcome would be different. However, until January 2017, the California standard required that new evidence point unerringly to innocence. It was considered an almost unattainable standard. In 2015, a false confession expert, Richard Leo, reviewed transcripts of Dahl's interrogations. Leo concluded that the methods used by detectives during the interrogation of Dahl were designed to pressure and persuade Dahl to adopt an account that matched the detectives' pre-existing beliefs about how and why the murder of Jane Hylton occurred. In 2016, though, the NCIP co-sponsored Senate Bill 1134. This bill allowed wrongfully convicted inmates, like Davis, to prove that new evidence would likely have been compelling to a jury. NCIP attorney Melissa O'Connell filed a petition for a new trial based on the new DNA evidence testing. Championed by former California State Senator Mark Leno, the bill was passed in January 2017, putting California's standard in line with that of 43 other states. In 2019, Superior Court Judge Kenneth Malikian vacated Davis's 2005 conviction and ordered a new trial. Initially set to start in fall of 2019, however, the judge announced the trial would take place in April 2020, citing the defense attorney's health as the catalyst for change in date. However, the fate of the trial was about to change once again. Advancements in DNA testing led to Davis becoming the first convicted person in California and the second in the United States to be exonerated for a crime. Genetic genealogy is a fairly new DNA testing concept. It involves taking DNA evidence from a crime scene and sending them to genetic companies. These companies then search family tree databases to find a potential match. In February 2020, DNA evidence matched to a man considered an unlikely suspect. El Dorado County Attorney Vern Pearson announced in February 2020 that a new suspect had been identified as the man linked to the DNA evidence found on Jane Hylton's body. Following the arrest, many people spoke to the media about the man they knew as Michael Green. Green was a longtime resident of Roseville, California. He graduated from Oakmount High School in 1986. He was described as an easygoing, kind person, even-tempered, and even super chill. One classmate who wanted to remain anonymous could not understand why Green would go to El Dorado Hills and brutally murder a woman. According to reports, Green was 17 years old at the time of Hylton's murder. On the night of July 6, 1985, the victim's daughter Autumn met Green and two of his friends, Calvin and Stephen. They hung out together at the park when Autumn decided to go home and have a shower before returning. Allegedly, Autumn told her mother she was going to another friend's house for the evening. Instead, she returned to the park to join the boys. What happened next is pure speculation. Investigators believe that during this time, Green broke into the house and was confronted by Jane. In a struggle to get away, Green may have attacked her in a frenzy. Following the attack, Jane's body was discovered by Davis, Dahl, and Autumn when they returned home. Green had no criminal convictions either before or after the murder. It seems he had led a normal life until DNA linked him to the gruesome crime. The other two boys who were with Green were tracked down shortly after his arrest. Calvin, unfortunately, had died some time ago. Stephen, however, was found and interviewed the day after the arrest. He was being treated as a witness and not a participant. Green was arrested on February 11, 2020. Since Green was a teenager at the time of the murder, he made his first appearance at a juvenile court on February 19, 2020. District Attorney Vern Pearson said that, procedurally, the court has to go through some steps on the juvenile side of it. Following this, Green was granted a transfer so that he could be tried as an adult. He waited 2.5 years before he would be tried in court. Green pleaded no contest on July 29, 2022. This plea means Green gave up his right to a jury trial. A jury trial meant he was to face a charge of first-degree murder. He also gave up his chance to challenge the plea or the consequences of his decision. His sentencing date was set for September 27, 2022, to be presided over by Judge Suzanne Kingsbury. At sentencing, Dr. Elizabeth Kaufman, a professor in psychological science education, was called in on educational capacity to explain to the court the development of an adolescent. Kaufman's research explained the varying development needs of adolescents with regard to emotional and cognitive development. The late adolescent stage allowed an individual to understand right from wrong, yet at the same time, they're also functioning under diminished capacity for impulse control. The defense called several witnesses from Green's childhood, some who even maintained relationships with him into adulthood. Each witness was asked if their opinion had changed of him since the knowledge of his confession. All witnesses agreed they'd been shocked to discover that he was responsible for the murder of Hylton. Individuals who knew him in varying capacities described him as jovial, popular, funny, and loving. These words were used to describe him before and after the murder. Green's ex-wife, Karen Green, said, "There's just not a bad bone in Mike." After witness statements were given, each of Jane Hylton's children presented their victim impact statements. They all described the unforgivable loss that Green inflicted upon their family. "The why it happened and how different my life could have been will haunt me forever," said Heather Purvis McConnell, one of Jane's daughters. Ardith Brandon, Hylton's fourth child, said, "I loved my mother, and I assume Michael loves his mother too. I want to know what he would feel or what he would say to the person who stabbed your mother 29 times. What would you do if you received an early morning call to tell you your mother is dead?" The court listened to her description of the feeling of gathering her mother's belongings from the house in which she was killed. Ardith finished with a powerful declaration. "We will always have something in common, regretting the stupid decision you made 37 years ago." Hylton's son Ian echoed his sister's sentiments. He went on to explain the uncertainty the family faced and the recurring nightmares they suffered, especially after the crooked finger of blame was pointed at his own sister, Autumn. He broke down in tears as he ended with an almost inaudible remark. "All the words we say will never bring my mother back." Autumn was the last to speak. Her statement showed true agony as she recounted the cloud of suspicion she'd lived under for the last 2 decades. Recounting the day 2 crew-cut thick mustache detectives came into her house telling her they found the people responsible for her mother's death, she was then repeatedly accused of biting her mother and helping move her body from the floor to the bed. Autumn went on to say that if she hadn't said the word lawyer at that point, she did not know how much further the intimidation tactics of the investigators could have gone. Afterwards, Deputy District Attorney Jay Linden read a statement on behalf of the family. In the statement, he asked Green what made him end Jane's life in such a brutal manner. "You beat her. She had numerous wounds around her head and face. By your own words, you kicked her jaw. You bit her on the shoulder. Why was that?" Linden continued to read the statement that expressed how Green didn't just murder Jane, he destroyed numerous lives in the process. Linden then asked Green if he'd given any thought about Jane and who she was. He pointed out her achievements and the love she had for each of her children. In closing arguments, Margaret Husher, Green's defense attorney, stressed the idea that he was unable to stop himself. She emphasized that he did not know what he was doing was wrong, as he was an adolescent at the time. This argument was based on the testimony of expert witness Dr. Kaufman. She asked that the court show mercy as she read off the multiple penal codes and rules of the court. Judge Kingsbury interjected by saying, "The court is not going to put him on probation," effectively ending any further comment from the defense. In response, Linden thanked the court and said the application for probation was offensive. He said, "It was a smack to this family who had endured this for decades." Linden stated that he already got away with murder for 37 years. Placing him on probation allowed him to get away with more. Judge Kingsbury said she had heard a multitude of arguments about murder cases surrounding adolescent development. She remarked that after her 26 years on the bench, Jane Hylton's murder was by far the most brutal. Before passing her sentence, Kingsbury asked the family for their forgiveness for the trauma they had suffered, although she was not originally assigned the case. She also hoped they would heal from the pain, as it would have been their mother's wish. Kingsbury then encouraged Green to use all resources at his disposal in the California Department of Rehabilitation. "You're the key to the questions these people have. Doing that could ultimately help you with your outcome as it relates to parole," said Kingsbury. In closing, Kingsbury pointed out that she had heard from his friends that there's a great side to him and that he has much to offer. She also said he was young enough to be released and live a productive life. Green was sentenced to 15 years to life and remanded to the El Dorado County Jail. He will then be transferred to the California Department of Rehabilitation. Restitution will be decided after further consideration by the court. Davis was released on February 13, 2020, and planned to celebrate over pizza with his family. His lawyer, Melissa O'Connell, said he will be entitled to more than $750,000 in state compensation for the wrongful conviction. Although the amount was high enough for him to re-enter society and start afresh, O'Connell said it could not make up for the years of freedom that he lost. Davis went on to sue the state for damages covering the period from May 21, 2002 to February 13, 2020 for a whopping $18 million. The lawsuit names El Dorado County as well as former detectives Richard Strasser, Rick Fitzgerald, Bill Wilson, who's deceased and being sued through his estate, and Larry Hennick. Sheriff's Office pathologist Dr. Robert Anthony has also been included in the complaint. The Village Life newspaper reported that Davis was homeless after being released. The lawsuit is still pending as of 2022. In September 2022, California passed Assembly Bill 2644. This bill would, commencing January 1, 2024, prohibit law enforcement officers from employing threats, physical harm, deception, or psychological manipulative interrogation tactics, as specified during a custodial interrogation of a person 17 years of age or younger. The bill faced opposition, but District Attorney Van Pearson is urging all law enforcement to stop using intimidation tactics. Pearson stated that 10 years ago, he would have viewed the methods used to get a confession differently. However, after seeing the true impact it can have, he believed there's room for change. This also comes after research points to deceptive tactics being used for years by law enforcement that will presume guilt and focus on getting a confession rather than getting the full story. The district attorney is implementing this new policy in his office and is urging other district attorneys to do the same. El Dorado County DA's office will now reject any case where the primary evidence is a confession obtained using threats, lies, or psychological manipulation interrogation tactics. These measures are to ensure that no one is ever again convicted based on a coerced false confession like the case of Ricky Davis. Pearson personally apologized to all involved in the miscarriage of justice caused by the tactics used by then investigators into the brutal 1985 murder of Jane Hylton. After 37 years, the right man is finally facing justice. Yet the lives of so many were left broken by mistakes and false accusations. For Jane Hylton's family, hopefully they can now pick up the pieces after being divided over the innocence of their own sister, Autumn. Ricky Davis can never regain the liberty he lost. And Michael Green destroyed not only the lives of the victim's family and friends, but the lives that he touched in the years before and after the murder. What are your thoughts on today's case? Did Michael Green deserve the sentence he received? Does his clean record, minus the murder, make him innocent of intentional murder? How could he let an innocent man take the blame for his actions? Can Ricky Davis ever get his life back on track even when he does receive compensation? And why is it taking so long? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, take care.